On us and save us. To our presentation on Polycarp, please, Dr. Brian F. Kumpel.
Give me a moment as I set myself up here again. All right, it's working.
You good?
All right. Actually, this turns out to be somewhat of a transition point. Up to this point, we have been speaking about Polycarp, the person, and his epistle that he wrote. And that's the only surviving work of his that we have. I think Irenaeus, his disciple, and also the major church father, said that he had written other epistles. But this is the one that has survived to date, so it's the only one of which we know for certain, certainly know its content. What we're switching to now is the text known as the Martyrdom of St. Polycarp, which is not obviously written by Polycarp. It is a narrative. Essentially, it's an epistle written by representatives of the Church of Smyrna. Smyrna in Asia Minor. It's basically on the west coast of Asia Minor. And it's written to the church at Philomelium. And the point was not only that they would hear the narrative of Polycarp's martyrdom, but that this epistle would be copied and forwarded to more churches. So it was basically addressed to the Church of Philomelium directly. But he also said, but also the letter says itself, but also to all the sojournings of the Holy Catholic Church in every place. It's actually another term often used instead of sojourning, so it'd be colonies. Now it's interesting, like we think, this is a term one sees, I believe, you see Chris Clement talks about, to the colony in Corinth, in his letter, 1 Clement. Now the thing is, why are they writing to themselves as colonies? And this is because Christians saw themselves basically as people living in a foreign land. They, are in this world, but not of this world, and they saw their true allegiances to the kingdom of God. So you'll often see this reflected in the term referring to church plantings as colonies. As time went on, one doesn't see this so much in later literature, but it's not that uncommon in this apostolic, sub-apostolic era to speak of that. And that's certainly how they, like for example, in this case, the Church of Smyrna is writing is to the colony, the sojournings of the Holy Catholic Church in every place. So this narrative is meant to be copied and spread elsewhere. And we'll be talking a little bit why they felt that there's a particularly good reason for that. But in the meantime, we're going to talk, when was this written? That depends, of course, on the date of his death. So we established a preference for 22nd of February 156, but 23rd February 155, a year earlier. Certainly a very strong contender. So you're getting really mid-150s. Now the key thing to understand about this particular epistle, it was written after his martyrdom, but not long afterward. It was essentially written put together by people who both were eyewitnesses of his martyrdom, but as well as, people who knew those eyewitnesses. So it's kind of a combination thing. So you're dealing within less than a year, no doubt, in my opinion. It would have been roughly around the same time. And the text as we possess it today is a little interesting because it shows a little bit of what happens when texts get copied by copyists. Because we have the first chapters, pretty much 1 through 20 are the original letter. But then you have a chronological addendum. This is when the date is given. Remember I mentioned the second Xanthikos of such and such year. That was written in chapter 21. That's kind of what I call a chronological addendum. Something was added on to give you the date of when all this happened. That wasn't part of the original narrative. Then you have also chapter 22, you sort of have a postscript, of commendation where this is being recommended. And then finally, toward the end of chapter 22, a brief history of the epistle being copied, where various copyists are speaking about depending and all. So, as far as that first bit, the chronological addendum giving the date, that could have really been like a postscript on a letter almost. In my opinion, it may have been that the original copyists themselves, may have actually, who narrated, may have actually penned that themselves. Okay, these events happened such and such and so and so. But the other things like the commendation and then certainly the discussion of I, the copyist Peonius, did such and so found these manuscripts and copied them because of a vision I had, where St. Polycarp told me where they were among the papers of Irenaeus. So that would obviously be written later. So you see a little bit of what's going on here. And you see the most extensive post-transmission discussion amongst the Moscow manuscript, which is the best Greek text of this particular narrative. So, there we have a good bit of this. Now, I better get a glass of water. Sorry, forgive me. That's better. As far as the reliability of this text, it's pretty good. Part of the reason is we have the testimony to this letter by none other than Eusebius, the church historian himself. He actually cites this book and, extensively, particularly all the sections narrating the events of the martyrdom itself. Now, he doesn't include everything in it. For example, he omits the prologue, which is the initial, the same as I said, general introduction, whatever, to the epistle. He doesn't mention that. Other things of chapters 1 through 4, Eusebius only quotes really the first half of the Martyrdom, chapter 1, the first verse as we say it, and then he summarizes the rest. Then in the text, he pretty much covers the martyrdom from chapters 5 through 19, and the whole final section, the post-transmission stuff, is gone. Now, but what is there pretty closely matches what we've got, almost word for word. Now the question is like, does that mean that those other sections were somehow not genuine? In this case, we'd have to say, almost certainly not. Because what Eusebius seemed to be doing is he was narrating the events of the martyrdom. And these chapters, the parts that were left out, like most of chapters 2, 3, and 4, were really theological sections, saying what was the theological importance of his martyrdom. It's actually very important. These things, actually, if you don't read these things, you won't understand what the theology of the text is. But Eusebius was concerned about passing on the events of the text, so it wouldn't have been of interest to him. So we have pretty good reasons to think that, yes, this is in fact accurate. Other reasons are simply because this is also narrated by people who knew Polycarp, who either were eyewitnesses to the event or knew eyewitness to the event. So it was within a generation of these events, actually probably even sooner than that. The significance of that will come to a little further. And another thing to understand is that, another reason why this is important is that it is really, as I mentioned earlier, the first Christian report of a martyrdom outside of the New Testament. Now, the part, as I mentioned earlier, was a narrative of the martyrdom of St. Stephen the Protomartyr, which basically runs from Acts 6, verse 8, through chapter 8, verse 2. You read that out, you'll have the story of St. Stephen the Protomartyr. That, in a way, you can say is the first narrative of martyrdom in Christian history, really. I mean, we hear about Peter and Paul and what may have happened, but these are much later narratives. But talking about events roughly at the time, outside of the New Testament, the book of Acts, we have the martyrdom of Polycarp. This is the first text which is properly a narrative of a martyrdom. And these are reasons why this is important. First, as we established earlier, St. Polycarp was an important transmitter of the apostolic tradition. We had covered that. Also, it's a report generated by eyewitnesses of the martyrdom, and also by a combination of those who may not have seen the martyrdom, but they were contemporaneous with it and knew those who knew it, so we're relating the report itself. And then secondly, the text served as one sees as a literary model for future narratives of martyrdoms. One will see that they tend to be recorded in the same sort of way. And what was the first one? Our text here. So this is actually one of the best, but it's also set the model literarily for other narratives. Also, there are a lot of interesting tidbits about textual, worship status going on. For example, we mentioned earlier, I've served the Lord for 86 years, which indicates that Polycarp, unless he was a centenarian or something, must have been baptized as an infant. So it means already around, 69, 70, infant baptism was an acceptable practice. So I'm sorry, you're at the time of the New Testament church at this point. So that's about the earliest clear instance we have of it. But it also provides examples of the veneration of the saints, their cultic celebration on the date of their martyrdom, considered their birthday into eternity, so to speak, but also the veneration of relics. So we're talking now around 155, 166, 157. He's showing just the very hoary antiquity in Christianity of these practices. At this point, you're still dealing, it's about 120 years after Christ's resurrection, roughly, but certainly only decades after really the death of the last apostle John, and so forth. So this is actually getting pretty old. It's showing that it is well-established, traditions, and this is very early narrations of this. And plus the theology of the veneration of saints and its role. We'll see that it's actually already mature here. And it will go into significance of that. Now, as to the general contents, we have our third handout. Might be just as easy to look at that. I won't necessarily read it to you. It says, Contents of the Martyrdom of Polycarp. You have a general introduction. And you have things like chapters 2 through 4, martyrdom according to God's will. You'll find this is the theological point of this text. Then, of course, the negative example, martyrdom, not according to God's will. When things go wrong, chapter 4. Then you have 5, pretty much up to, 16, and it was basically his virtue and courage and his narration of his, the persecution, his arrest, his trial, his martyrdom. Then you through about 16, and then you find the removal of his body, and also like what the final fate of it was, and and also start dealing with things like the veneration of relics and so forth. In chapter 19, the conclusion and a basic conclusion that this was a martyrdom of the gospel model. In chapter 20, final salutations, commendations, and an event summarized by Marcianus and penned by Everestus. Now what's interesting about this Marcianus, it seems, what I think may have happened here, it seems like it was actually, Marcianus came up with this narrative, the general summary events. It wasn't meant to be a complete summary, and they say it in actually the letter. But it seems like it was penned by Everestus. So some people think that Marcianus wrote something and Everestus maybe rewrote it. I think what happened is that Marcianus may not have been literate. We don't know that. I think he related the events, and Everestus was the scribe who not only wrote it down, but then, maybe wrote the final concluding post, like the date of the martyrdom. I think may have been put down by Everestus himself, like when this happened. Then concluding postscripts, and so forth. That's just a quick overview of the letter. I don't think we need to dwell on that unduly, but it's good to know. Skipping along. It's important for us to deal with the theology of the text. Now, this is very important. this is a narrative, it's not just a story. Like, this is martyrdom. He was a brave saint and he was a martyr. Well, he was saying all these things. But it actually has a very highly developed theology, so worthy of imitation. And we'll go into that a little bit. They'll talk about starting really, not only in the first chapter, but also in the 19th chapter, that this was a martyrdom on the gospel model. And let's take a look. Let's cite from the very beginning, the first chapter. For one might also say that all that had gone on before him, previous martyrdoms, happened in order that the Lord might show to us from above a martyrdom in accordance with the gospel. Also, he was not only a famous teacher, but a notable martyr, whose martyrdom all desired to imitate, for it followed the gospel of Christ. That's what this text is saying about Polycarp's martyrdom. It was on the gospel model. It's following exactly as Christ would have a martyrdom go. So, the gospel model of martyrdom. What exactly to understand what this text is saying is martyrdom on the model of the gospel, on the model gospel, that model. That binds this whole text together. It makes it more than just a sad or happy story, depending on how you look at it. It tells us why this martyrdom is important, why we should be attending to it, and why should anybody else become a martyr, they should pay attention to this. And there are two parts, two major themes in martyrdom as in the gospel model. First of all, it has to be a martyrdom according to God's will. Secondly, a martyrdom as an imitation of Christ's passion. These are the two main points. And we'll deal with this and start, drilling down now. First, we'll start with martyrdom according to God's will. Now let's start with chapter 2. Now, those 2 and 3 particularly will go into discussions of what makes a martyrdom valid, or particularly virtuous or praiseworthy. Well, this is what they're saying themselves. Blessed then, and this is not yet about Polycarp, but about the martyrdoms prior to him and leading up to him, and actually including him as well. Blessed then and noble are all the martyrdoms which took place according to the will of God. For we must be very careful to assign the power over all to God. For who would not admire the nobility and patience and love of their master? For some were torn by scourging until the mechanism of their flesh was seen, even to the lower veins and arteries. And they endured so that even the bystanders pitied them and mourned. Some even reached such a pitch of nobility that none of them groaned or wailed, showing to all of us that at the hour of their torture, the noble martyrs of Christ were absent from the flesh, or rather, that the Lord was standing by and talking with them, and paying heed to the grace of Christ, they despised worldly tortures, by a single hour purchasing everlasting life. And the fire of their cruel tortures had no real heat for them, for they set before their eyes an escape from the fire which is everlasting and is never quenched. And with the eyes of their heart they looked up to the good things which are preserved for those who have endured, which neither ear hath heard nor eyes have seen, nor hath it entered into the heart of man. But it was shown by the Lord to them, who are no longer men, but already angels. And in the same way also those who were condemned to the beast endured terrible torment, being stretched on sharp shells and buffeted with other kinds of various torments, that if it were possible, the tyrant might bring them to a denial by continuous torture. For the devil used many wiles against them. This is a general summary of past martyrdoms, and he'll talk about what mentions why this is so forceful, is that Polycarp is like the 12th martyrdom recorded in Smyrna, including others that were brought in from the local city of Philadelphia to be executed there in the arena. So his martyrdom was seen as kind of like an ultimate martyrdom, which actually concluded the tumults which had led up to that point. And so it was kind of a prime example, but a culmination of this persecution, and they think of it that way. But keep things a little bit now, they're talking about what makes martyrdoms worthwhile. First of all, it has to be in God's will. God has to have, this is not something that just happened, it's according to God's will that this should happen. And when that happens, the martyrs can be blessed and noble and possess patience and love, and because they've been given the strength from God to endure this. They're given the grace to endure it. And so, as if they're capable of such things, mainly because of the grace of God given to them precisely to endure these things. And it is interesting when we hear them describe some of these details, it gets a little gory. One does have the feeling, however, it's not exaggerated, however. And we'll talk about that a little bit, because some of the legendary tales of martyrdoms that are written later, they get pretty fantastic and they get remarkably gory. And you'll read cases of this holy martyr went through this torture, and then torture number 1, torture number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number however many, and to finally, I guess, they get tired and they lop off his head or something. And it gets kind of wild at times. This case, it's really maybe a paragraph, but what's being said is graphic enough, and one gets the feeling that they had seen these events themselves, and it comes, I feel like it has that sense of, we're really speaking about an eyewitness here. But the point is that martyrdom had to be, these events had to be in the will of God, something that God had willed for. And so that when the martyrs approached their end, they actually had the grace to be able to endure it. And it's interesting, it notes that here's the speculation of the onseers, the people who were seen as Christians. Either in all that pain that they should have been in, but they didn't seem to be writhing and going crazy and screaming and stuff, necessarily. Either they were absent from their body, or the Lord was with them, consoling them at that moment, and they were thus mindful of the rewards they were going to. It's interesting, you're having the speculations, how they were able, what might have been going on with them in their own consciousness at that time. But this is the speculations of the onlookers, the Christian onlookers, what's happening. But the point is, if martyrdom is according to the will of God, then you have the grace to endure this. A prime example of this now moves on to chapter 3. That was just summarized in chapter 2. Is Germanicus and his companions, but especially Germanicus, are prime examples. And what these were fed to lions. And Germanicus, it seems like he may have been like trying to outdo Ignatius, maybe. I want to be ground up. I want to be fine wheat and have be the lions be my wheat mill, turn me into bread and the flour. So Germanicus, when he was out there, when the lions were a little bashful, started goading them on to eat them, which Ignatius said he'd like to do. It seems that Germanicus really did that. And it's interesting, he did not, when the proconsul said, come on, make the sacrifice, pray for the luck of the emperor, so forth. Instead, he brought the lion on himself and tried to speed it up because he wanted to leave this sinful world so quickly and be with the Lord. It's interesting, so what happened is that he was egging on the lions. So, which Ignatius said that he was going to do. Well, at least he probably did too. But we know certainly Germanicus did it because that's what they're telling us. And again, but they endured. Germanicus and all the people who were with him, not one recanted, not one denied Christ. They all followed through and had the grace to do so. To the point that the local native people there were getting really upset and said, here's a fine, handsome young man being a lunatic and committing suicide. Who's the crotchety old dude who's causing him to do that? Polycarp, that's who. Let's go get him. And then there starts a riot, which eventually leads to the arrest of Polycarp. But that's the kind of events in it. The theology is, This is a specific example which led up to the arrest of Polycarp and his martyrdom, but it too followed the gospel model, and you can see because here's brave young Germanicus. They say, hey lion, if you want to eat me, okay, here's my head, I'll stick it in your mouth. Let's say, I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm taking it rather lightly. Lion wanted to eat me, I'm afraid, sorry, you'll have to be vegetarian today, and I didn't run. I'm afraid, unless it was God's will, then maybe I'd have the courage, but I've got to admit right now, I'm not the bravest person one could imagine. In any case, chapter 4 is interesting. This is what you could say is, don't let this happen to you. This is the bad example of Quintus, who came from Phrygia, which we're from Pontus. And it's interesting, Phrygians had a reputation in antiquity for being a bunch of cowards. You know, I remember how Paul said all Cretans are liars. Well, apparently somebody must have thought that all Phrygians were cowards. I don't know. But in any case, it turned out he was a coward. Now, what was interesting, he did give in to the proconsul's blandishments and sacrifice, and we didn't really hear about what happened to his comrades. But what distinguished him is that he did not have a martyrdom on the gospel model. Why? He turned himself in. This was not something, a martyrdom, that God allowed to take place. It was something he was presuming to bring upon himself. So he presumed to become a martyr. It wasn't a gift given by God. It was something, it was a treasure he was trying to snatch for himself. And as a result, he did not have the grace to endure. And this is what they have to say about this. And they say, for this reason, therefore, brethren, we do not recommend those who give themselves up, since the gospel does not give this teaching. So, no, don't go around committing suicide for Christ. Don't just go out of the way and make a spectacle of yourself. And this is very important because, as I mentioned, the possibility of martyrdom was always possible. It wasn't necessarily probable. But the church is certainly not going to survive if everybody just decides to be a fool and commit suicide. And the problem is this was a possibility that people would do things like this. We saw this with Quintus, because you could see people saying, well, for an hour's torture, I get eternal life. Well, that's true. But then presuming that you have the sufficient guts to go through that hour, which is not our own courage, by God's grace, and in doing it, we have the bad example here by somebody who presumed to bring a virtue upon himself which he did not really possess by God's grace. And that's not something, that's presumption. That isn't virtue. And also the church, there were times when there's some voluntary martyrdoms that didn't get condemned, but mostly the church opposed this. And there's some pretty practical reasons. How is the church supposed to survive and lead to the salvation and regeneration of the world if everybody's running off trying to get themselves killed by doing things like this? And that just didn't make any sense. So the church, on the whole, did not condone this. And as a matter of fact, they're pretty unambiguous that one should not do it. And still, even the examples, imagine, the examples, etc., because there have been, like, I think Galerius, the emperor, among others, the way they often responded, the persecutors who responded to this would be like, we didn't want to slaughter millions of Christians, thousands of Christians. We didn't think they'd be so obtuse and be willing to die in numbers like that. They just thought, what kind of fanatics are these? So you have to take into account how things would be responded to by others. But also, just, there would be some of these, comments by some of these judges and others like, isn't there plenty of rope enough in the country if these people want to kill themselves? Why do they want me to be their executioner? There's a sense that rushing out and, these guys, Christians had a bad reputation for despising life. And even, I referred to this earlier, this was, basically I remember that narrative we talked about with both Ignatius and the Didache, where you had that one fraudulent philosopher who became a Christian for a while and recanted and so forth. And it was considered a mockery at that point by others. Thought this was ridiculous, and the church did not want to have this kind of thing happening. So martyrdom but the key spiritual virtue is martyrdom is a gift of God according to God's will, and when that's the case, they have the benefits and the strength to do so. And if you remember in the Gospels, I believe particularly in the Synoptic Gospels, when Christ talks about persecution coming, and he says, don't think ahead of time about what you have to say. I will give you the words at that point. Meaning, this is not something you kind of screw yourself up for. It's something that, should it come about in the will of God that this should happen, you will have the grace to do so. So this is not something that should be the fruit of presumption, but the fruit of humility and accepting the will of God and then receiving the grace, not just trying to seize it for yourself. So that's an important thing. And we see in Polycarp's martyrdom several incidents in the way this narration, this tale is told to us, that indicate to us that indeed the Polycarp's own martyrdom was exemplary and accepted by God. First of all, when he's in the arena, first brought on, the believers heard a voice saying, "Be strong, Polycarp, and play the man." Nobody knew who said it, but they heard the voice. Then, when he was being burnt, when they offered to nail him to the stake, he said, "Just tie me, I'm not running anywhere." And they just tied him. Then they burned him, and then the flames kind of formed a sail around him, and he was kind of baking inside. And that was seen as a sign that God was blessing his martyrdom. The Christians related that they smelt kind of like a sweet aroma, like incense, when he was dying. So that is an indication of God's blessing on his martyrdom, that this was a martyrdom along the gospel model. And also the fact that he would do things like wait for his martyrdom like Christ did, and so forth. These are various signs that his martyrdom was according to the will of God. And when one does this, should God, in God's will that happen, one will have the grace and the wherewithal spiritually to be able to do so. But martyrdom is unendurable without the grace of God. And that was the fate of Quintus. He did not have the grace of God for this. He could not endure. This is not something in human strength. One needs the grace of God to do this. So that's why we don't presume to bring it on ourselves. As he said, we do not commend those who give themselves up, since the gospel does not give this teaching. And in fact, it does not. Now it's interesting. So martyrdom has to be in the will of God, not the will of the person being martyred, in the sense that they're actively bringing it on themselves. But martyrdom also has to be an imitation of Christ's saving passion. And let's just read a little bit. This is, again, from the first chapter. And this is, "We write to you, brethren, the story of the martyrs and of the blessed Polycarp, who put an end to the persecution by his martyrdom, as though adding the seal. One might almost say that all that had gone on before happened in order that the Lord might show to us from above a martyrdom in accordance with the gospel. For he, Polycarp, waited to be betrayed, as also the Lord had done, that we too might become his imitators, both of the Lord and of Polycarp, not thinking of ourselves alone, but also of our neighbors. For it is the mark of a true and steadfast love, not to wish that oneself may be saved alone, but all the brethren also." So Christ died on behalf of us all, not for his own sake. Of course, Christ is God. He did not need salvation. He is salvation. But he died for our salvation, for the salvation of others. Polycarp's martyrdom, following the gospel model and imitating the passion of Christ, mimicked clearly the martyrdom of Christ, waiting for martyrdom as Christ did, but also in setting an example for others so that others might be saved. Christ died so others may be saved. Martyrdom for Polycarp came in such a way so it was a model so that others, should they become martyrs, should follow this model and themselves be saved. So set an example for others. So Polycarp, like Christ the Lord, was concerned with the salvation of others. But it's a clear thing. Polycarp's martyrdom followed the gospel model because it imitated Christ's martyrdom. Now, but there's several things that are very memorable, like when he stated in a vision beforehand where he was running, when he was in hiding and he had a dream that, that he was sleeping and the pillow under him burnt up, and he woke and said, I must be burnt alive. He's assuming that would be his fate, which in case happened. It indicated a foreknowledge of his forthcoming fate, imitating Christ's foreknowledge. It's interesting. He said that he was, Christ was betrayed by his own, by a couple boy servants of his, in a way Christ was deliberately betrayed by Judas. It's also interesting, both had, administrators or prosecutors, whatever you want to call it, government officials named Herod presiding over their trials. You have, so these things, you have several explicitly listed imitations where it said, Christ had this event, Polycarp had this event too. Like, for example, both were betrayed by their own. Both waited for the martyrdom. Both had foreknowledge of their fates. Both, even had their trials presided over by somebody called Herod. I mean, these were explicitly put out in the text. Most of these parallels, however, are not explicitly listed, but they're pretty hard to miss. They're implicit. And if you go to our final handout, and point out it's yours will be two-sided. Mine, I have it separate sheets, but the first side you'll see the biblical parallels of Polycarp's martyrdom per the martyrdom of Polycarp. And the front side, martyrdom on the model of Christ. And I'll just read the titles, but you'll see like what way it's laid out. Christ and St. Polycarp foreknew their fates. You see the martyrdom, that's where you see the references of Polycarp. Then all the scriptural parallels to this. Christ and St. Polycarp waited to be betrayed. Christ and St. Polycarp prayed before being taken. Christ and St. Polycarp did not flee their fates. Christ and St. Polycarp were betrayed by their own. Christ and St. Polycarp faced persecutors named Herod. Christ and Polycarp were seized as bandits. Christ and St. Polycarp submitted to God's will. Christ and St. Polycarp entered the city riding an ass. So Christ and St. Polycarp faced the enraged crowd. Christ and St. Polycarp are sacrifices acceptable to God. Christ and St. Polycarp's sacrifices are as sweet aromas. Christ and St. Polycarp prayed before their deaths. And both Christ and St. Polycarp were pierced. And so when you have so many parallels in the text, it is quite obvious this is not meant to be coincidental. These were all parallel events which the narrators, of the writers and the scribe passed on that they saw as deliberate parallels. They saw this as Polycarp's martyrdom followed the death and passion of Christ, not just mere coincidental details, but in close detail. How many do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 parallels here. So these are things that, in seeing Polycarp's martyrdom and paying close attention to the traditions of the Passion of Christ, that they saw these are close parallels. It cannot be, by their reckoning, any sort of coincidence. Polycarp, who basically brought to an end that round of persecution they were experiencing in Smyrna at that point, also provided the prime example of what a martyr should be like. Part of it is it was in the will of God. He did not bring it on himself, so he had the grace. But he also emulated and followed the model of the Passion of Christ in close detail. So this made it a martyrdom according to God's will. And so it's not passing details, is close imitation of Christ. So he followed Christ closely in his life, so he followed him at the moments before his death. And hence why his martyrdom is so considered such a good example for all of us. And this is not really a moot point for the church in the age of persecution, because for anybody, persecution was a possibility. And when you have to worry about that, having good role models is important. And you also didn't want any nut running out and trying to bring it on themselves. So having a proper model, I said, if you want to see what it's like to be a model, here is a model. Hence the reason for this letter and why it's being passed around. Because it was intended through this letter that Polycarp's martyrdom would be seen as a role model for others to follow should it come along. And we'll see examples in this text where he actually says so, pretty clearly, the narrators. Now it's interesting, I had mentioned that if you flip over, you'll see 4 entries. The first 3 are correct. The last one's a typographical thing that I forgot to remove. So sorry about that. They're not only parallels to between Polycarp's martyrdom and that of Christ, but also Polycarp's martyrdom and the martyrdom eventually of St. Paul. For example, we have, for example, the Apostle Paul and Polycarp accept God's will concerning martyrdom. What I mean by that is that if we read in the book of Acts, for example, where the saints of Tyre and Paul finally accept God's faith at Paul's arrest, and he's on his way to Rome. The Apostle Paul and Polycarp both faced enraged mobs. It's actually interesting if we actually read this. For example, in Polycarp, when he was announced as a Christian, this is what they said. This is the teacher of Asia, the father of all the Christians, the destroyer of our gods, and teaches many neither to offer sacrifice nor to worship. Pretty interesting here. That's from chapter 12, verse 2. But let's look what people are crying up in Ephesus about Paul in Acts chapter 19, 24-41. This is what they said. Moreover, ye see and hear that not alone in Ephesus, but almost throughout all Asia, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying that they be no gods, which are made with hands, so that not only this our craft is in danger to be set at naught, but also that the temple and the great goddess Diana should be despised, and her magnificence should be destroyed, and whom all Asia and the world worshipeth. So you're dealing with similar thing. Polycarp and Paul were seen as destroyers of the local cults and a danger, and the crowd is enraged about this. And it's interesting also, the Apostle Paul and Polycarp offer to explain Christianity to their officials who were investigating them. For example, to the proconsul, Polycarp said, well, if you'd like to know what Christianity is, set aside a time, I'll tell you. And of course his response is, save it for the crowd. He tried to tell them, and he said, well, it's a waste of time with them, but I want to say to you, because we've been trained to respect the officialdom and to submit to your will. And he's clearly showing examples not only of following Paul and respecting authorities, which is what Paul himself had said actually when he was addressing things, but it also reflects the theology of Romans 13, which states that all authority on earth is ultimately put in place by God. So it's clearly reflecting this Pauline tradition. So there are not as many parallels, 3 clear ones. Sorry about number 4, Christ and Polycarp both are pierced. I just should have removed that and I forgot to. So sorry about that. But in any case, we also have parallels with the Apostle Paul. And though that's not as central to the theology of the martyrdom, yet it is hit. So what we have, in short, is that we have this narrative telling us not only was Polycarp a martyr, but why was he such a martyr to be followed? And why are we writing this letter so that all can know about it? The reason simply being is that this is a martyrdom on the gospel model. First, he did not seek it as martyrdom, but when it came his way, he didn't flee it. Well, you could say, well, yeah, he did. He did go in hiding. But the details of the narrative said was when he heard about the riot and people started looking for him, he wanted to stay in the city. And then what happened was the believer said, come on, you can't stay here and wait for them. So he went to one of his properties. Apparently he was a wealthy man. And the properties in the country, and he stayed there. And then they were running after that, and then he was moved again. And then eventually at the second place, he just said, all right, it's enough. They're gonna get me. He submitted. But what happened at the second place, they seized the house, tortured 2 of the young servants, and they were the ones who told them, okay, this is where they took Polycarp. So hence, they got to play the role of Judas. Except for at least there's one thing on their behalf, I'll say they were tortured, Judas was not. But when finally he was arrested, what he did is he just said to them, okay, he was up in the attic, he came down, it was the middle of the night, he offered them food, as much as they want. He said, please give me a couple hours to pray, and he went and prayed, for the church, everybody knew, and so forth. And then he handed himself over to be arrested. So he didn't seek martyrdom, but he didn't try very hard to flee it. He didn't exactly just stay put, but he only changed his location when the church, local believers said, please, come on. Don't be a sitting duck. But he didn't try very hard. And he saw it already through his dream of the burning pillow that what his fate was going to be. So effectively what it boiled down to, he had received the grace of God because it was God's will that he should end up becoming a martyr. And so he was able to be a glorious testimony for our Lord, but also because he followed the model of the gospel in close detail by emulating Christ's passion, step by step, as we see in these 14 different emulations and similarities, which by the reckoning of the church of Smyrna was not coincidental. It was deliberate. It was God showing the church. This is how they looked at it. This is what an ideal martyrdom is like. So we have various, throughout history, examples of excellence. So this is considered an example of excellence in martyrdom. This is what's considered as meritorious if one is to be a martyr. And this is essentially the theology of this text. The martyrdom was a good thing in the will of God and following the teachings of the gospel in close emulation of the passion of Christ. And that's what this is teaching. That's the theology of this text. And it's this theology in many ways which is really the heart. It's what binds the whole narrative together. Because otherwise it's just a tale of an execution. Well, a lot of people got executed. And, it doesn't have any specific significance for the church, but this does. It's particularly this theological understanding which gives it its meaning. And this will also help us to understand in our next session, because I'm about to conclude this one, is why hagiography, a literature of the lives of the saints, is special. What is a characteristic of it? Because the key thing is, they're not meant to be historical narratives per se, although they can relate historical events. They have a theological understanding of these events, which they want to inculcate in their readers. We see it clearly here. And what's interesting is this is perhaps outside of the book of Acts, is the first incident that we have of this kind of literature. And it's set a model, so to speak, for others. So not only was Polycarp's martyrdom kind of an ultimate example of what martyrdom should be, the narration of his martyrdom turned out to be a model for other martyrdom narratives to follow. And at that point, I'll hand over Father Herman, and then when we come back, we'll talk about hagiography.
Thank you, Brian Ephraim. Well, so far I think we've learned a great deal about Polycarp and his example of Christ. We're now